Are you familiar with FBI Special Agents Kyle Seraphin?
I'm familiar with the name.
Is that yes?
I'm familiar with the name. Familiar with the name. Familiar with the name.
Let's bring in Kyle Seraphin. He's the FBI whistleblower who helped expose government censorship of our First Amendment rights.
Now, we only have this memo because a recently suspended FBI agent called Kyle Seraphin brought it to the public. And we're grateful that he did. Kyle, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
He's the host of something that strangely is called the Kyle Seraphin Show.
Kyle Seraphin, I can't thank you enough for speaking out. I knew you guys were out there, and I knew it was just a matter of time. But you got a lot of guts putting your face and your name to this. You're doing a service on behalf of the American people, and from the bottom of my cracked and broken heart sometimes, thank you very much.
Take a look behind the curtain with a real whistleblower and American patriot. Prepare to embrace the uncomfortable truth because this program has no time for comforting lies. Here is civil liberties enthusiast, Second Amendment defender, and recovering FBI agent Kyle Seraphin.
Well, hello, my friends, and welcome to the Kyle Seraphin Show. Today is Wednesday, and it is March the 13th. We are midweek, and we are mid-interview cycle here. We've got a whole week full of interviews that you guys are going to enjoy, and I think you guys will appreciate this one as well. Today's guest is going to be Ron Coleman. No, not Ronnie Coleman, the bodybuilder, although, as he has told me, they've never been in the same room together. No one can prove they're not the same guy. We're going to have a good interview, a little discussion about free speech, about religion, its place in the workplace, its place in your life as it sets your values. I think you guys are going to get a good kick out of this. And let's bring on Mr. Ron Coleman. All right, folks, today's guest, Ron Coleman, he needs a little bit of introduction because he's a lawyer, he's an activist, he's a podcast host, he's semi-retired. He's very funny. He let me on his podcast and we had a lot of fun with it. It was actually probably one of the most fun podcasts that I've done. And I'm going to bring him on right now. Mr. Coleman, thanks for joining me.
How you doing? Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And your podcast is like a play on words. It's the culmination, which you think some people probably don't get, but I think my audience gets that. What do you think?
I think your audience is well above average, although some of the smartest people in the world haven't gotten it. Because it's like other people's shows where they call themselves like a nation thing. But I never would pretend to think that there's a nation, like that I have a nation dedicated to me. I mean, who used to do that? It was that crazy old Jewish guy who did radio. I don't remember his name now, but he had a
whole nation of followers.
He had a nation. I don't have a nation, but culmination, finishing. The fact of the matter is, culmination isn't really a great concept either. I wanted a pun because that's what I do.
Yeah,
but what's the pun? I mean, why would anyway, here, I'm glad to be on your much more logically entitled.
I'm not sure that we're going to do that. I think we're going to prove otherwise right now. Let me throw it on the screen here, folks. Culmination Season 3 is going on. You can find me on Season 2, and I had a lot of fun doing it. It was one of the more, I'm telling you, it was one of the more fun conversations that I've done in this space.
Yeah. As you know, I used as an excerpt your comparison of leaving the FBI to breaking up with a crazy girlfriend.
It's a spot on. It's 100%. All right.
I'm sure your listeners have heard use it many times.
Yeah, we call the FBI my ex-girlfriend. They love that. It's the easiest way to quickly convey a point, and that's what we're all about. All right. So as people can tell by your voice, you're from just outside of Dallas, and let's tell about who you are as a person.
Is it really that obvious?
that Texan blood, it shines through. I can see it by the cowboy hat. Tell folks a little bit about kind of who you are as a person, where you grew up. I want to kind of give them that lens before we get sarcastic.
Well, yeah, it's like this is long form.
Yeah, as long
program here. I am originally from Brooklyn, New York, the Brooklyn, New York section of Texas.
Yes,
and I went to the public schools in New York, and that meant that my parents saw what was going on during one of the earlier crises of urban left-wing meltdown, which took place in the late 60s and early 70s. So we participated in part of the Great White Flight, leaving the city in the early 70s and moved to New Jersey's first planned unit development, which was called Twin Rivers in East Windsor, New Jersey.
Was that a prestigious move, the White Flight?
It all depends on what you're used to. I mean, moving from a 2-bedroom apartment to a 4-bedroom attached house to us was pretty much a Beverly Hillbillies in reverse. Like, wow, we have our own postage stamp sized backyard, and we were very, very, and plus central air conditioning. Oh
That's
man,
big time.
we were, and I lived there through my high school years. I attended Hightstown High School,
Mhm.
and then found myself quite surprisingly, at college at Princeton University. And I say surprisingly, not because I didn't always know I was the smartest guy in the world, but I didn't necessarily think that it would come out that way. Neither of my parents had attended college. My mother is an immigrant. She legal, of course. She came here from Cuba. Her parents having left Poland, the Polish Jews who wisely left Poland in the 1930s. My father was an orphan who was raised by his grandmother on the Lower East Side of New York, and we were, regular kind of people. So no one had gone to college, and all of a sudden, I'm in this unbelievable world. And in
Like an
those
elite
days,
college too, right? I mean, that's
yeah, well, yeah, I mean,
back when that
was
meant something.
that was the long shot. That
Yeah.
was the long shot. I was like everybody else. I was prepared to go to Penn if I had to, but I sold him a bill of goods, and apparently I had a great time in college, learned some stuff, but mostly had a great time.
Mhm.
I was a radio DJ. I was, a singer, a dancer, a writer, everything. Like I said, and sometimes I went to the library, not too much.
Did you have a bar that was called the library outside of Princeton? Is that a thing there?
No, so people could say to their parents that I'm at the library.
Yeah, this was a big thing. So they imported that. There must be one maybe outside of Yale. They had one of those where I went to school in Oklahoma, and you could go to the library. You could tell your wife if you were a grad student or whatever, and you'd be like, "No, I'm at the library grading papers." We did grade papers. We just had beer.
Well, keep in mind, in my day, there wasn't the kind of. I graduated in 1985, so there were no cell phones. Like, if your parents heard from you once a week from the phone in your room, that was considered to be respectable. Okay, so it wasn't so much they were calling you and wondering where you were, you know. But I went on to law school at Northwestern University in Chicago. Worked in a bunch of law firms of different sizes, none of which really was a very, very good match for me, because the bigger the firm, the worse of a match.
Mhm.
I am a little bit of an out of the box guy, but I'm a litigator. I developed an interest in uh, trademark law and ended up getting involved in a lot of very cool trademark law cases, and also in free speech. And in fact, part of what I had sold Princeton on was that I had been involved in the writing and publication of an underground newspaper, such as it was, an underground mimeograph uh, newspaper in high school. And so I was very interested in free speech and censorship, and also in brands. Um, and I got a little bit more and more into speech, and especially when the internet was invented
By Al
after
Gore.
by Al Gore, and I remember it very clearly. I remember him rolling that out, and I began to see on the internet, from a business perspective, how intellectual property laws, such as copyright and trademark in particular, were being used as a way to shut down competition,
Hmm.
and also to shut down wrongthink. So I got a little bit more and more involved in that sort of stuff. And ultimately, I had the experience of appearing before the United States Supreme Court in a case called Mattel versus Tam, which was a perfect fusion of trademark law and free speech, in which the United States Supreme Court affirmed a ruling that we had secured from the U.S. Circuit Court for the Federal Circuit, U.S. Circuit Court for the Federal Circuit, to the effect that the U.S. government could not refuse to register a trademark on the ground that it was disparaging, because that just don't cut it under modern First Amendment law. Government can't decide what points of view it will endorse and which ones it will not endorse. Trademark registration is a ministerial act. If you do X, Y, and Z, use a trademark in commerce, in interstate commerce, and it's really legitimately entitled to be recognized as a trademark, fields don't matter. And that was the ruling.
That's a very modern take on it. The fields don't matter. And yet, isn't it interesting that a lot of this stuff is coming back into view, because we keep seeing, it seems like the government is coming in with either a hand on the scale, or they're looking for an outcome. One of the guys that I talk to all the time, Bill Shipley, talks about the government is supposed to remain agnostic. That's really the purpose of government. It's not supposed to have any of those fields, as you said. How interesting is it? What year was that Supreme Court ruling?
2017 was the Supreme Court ruling.
Okay. And then as you've seen that kind of roll forward and some of the other sort of infringements in that space, did you start off as a conservative guy? Is that where you were in the household? Is that at a young age was your dissident?
You know that famous expression that is attributed to Winston Churchill, although nobody knows that he actually said it. If you're a young man and you've never been a liberal, you have no heart. And if you're an older man and you're not a conservative, you don't have a brain. I never had a heart. I was like the guy from what was the show? What was that show? How can I didn't really actually watch it, but there was the family something
Family Ties?
with
No.
Family Ties. Yeah,
Okay.
where they had a son who was this conservative, and the rest of the family was a bunch of hippies.
Right.
So I was always that guy, and that was despite the fact that I grew up in a fairly. I mean, my parents were not particularly ideological, but I did attend Jewish Labor Bund summer camp for 6 years. This was before I became religious. I became an observant Jew. I decided to step up my religious observance after college and before law school. So, and when I did that, one Orthodox friend who I'd had in college was my roommate, and his mother introduced me to my wife. Later, I said, "Well, now you make sense, because before you didn't really make a lot of sense. You had all these right-wing views, but you didn't really have the true theological basis for it." And my problem was that I didn't really understand that a Jewish person, like, there aren't really different kinds of Jewish obligations to God. God says, Jewish people, here's what you have to do. Can't eat this, you got to eat that. Got to get up in the morning, you got to go to say your prayers. And that's for everybody. So I never wanted to displease God.
Mm-hmm.
So
can we go down that road a little bit? And here's why I say that. In the Northeast, people are very familiar with sort of culturally Jewish people and then religiously Jewish people. Where I grew up in Texas, there are no Jewish people that we are aware of. I think there's some in Houston, and there's some now, but not that anybody was really understood. So my first real big experience with this was my wife, who is from Brooklyn as well. Her buddies a lot of them were Jewish guys, and they'd come down and they would talk about Jewish stuff, like at a bar in Austin, Texas, and they're like doing this talk back and forth, this New York Jewish thing. And I'm like, guys, knock it off. Like, nobody here knows what you're talking about, and you just seem weird. Like, this is not the place for this. And they're doing this thing. He's like, look at your Jewy nose. Like, look at you. Like, everyone knows what's going on in your head. And I'm going, this is Texas America, man. Like, nobody has the concept of it. So I'd love to go down that rabbit hole a little bit. Cultural,
yeah, actually, and I'm the best person in the world to go down it with you, because I have thought about this a lot, and I've written on the topic, and one of the things that I consider to be my job on social media is to acquaint Americans with what we might call the 21st century version of Orthodox Jews who are conservative. People think of Jewish people as being liberal, and in fact, Orthodox Jews are overwhelmingly politically conservative. super family oriented. I married off my youngest son, although his twin, who is 3 minutes older, is still on the market. And he's 25. These, in our circles, not that's not late, but it's a little bit beyond the median.
Mhm.
I have more grandchildren than I would like to say because we are a little bit superstitious about that kind of thing. But I have 2 other married children, very family oriented, very traditional, and we are embarrassed to a large extent by the prevalence of Jewish people doing the wrong things and saying the wrong things. And, we consider that to be a fairly predictable result of what happens when you separate yourself from God. Because you're pretty much either there or you're not.
Mhm.
And people, you know, aren't comfortable with that, but I'm not here to make people comfortable, Kyle.
There's no reason. Yeah. I mean, and you know what's interesting too is that I think this is the time when that is going to be the most relevant to most folks. We're seeing this sort of there's been a soft and squishy culture in America for the last maybe 30 years, maybe 40 years. I don't know where it got softer and squishier where everything was okay. And if you think it, it's fine and all this kind of nonsense. And then it got like the hard way has always been the way that people have sought out. At least people with principle have always looked for something like what's difficult, what's being asked of me. How do I achieve that? There's a reason why the Navy SEALs recruit. And most people don't become Navy SEALs. They become dudes who like chip paint on a battleship. Finding things that are hard.
I don't think we even do that anymore.
Do we not? We have somebody else. We have like.
Have you seen these pictures of U.S. Navy ships with rust on them? In history, the U.S. Navy has never sailed around with rusty ships. We don't do that anymore.
We have more drag queens than we need, though.
That's right. DEI is job one.
Yeah.
But yes, you're right. You have to find a mission.
Mm-hmm.
You have to. If you go through life floating through it without meaning and without some kind of uphill struggle, you might get by just fine. But you're going to, if you even, I mean, look, anyone who has children and raises them, or as my wife insists you say, rears them.
Mm-hmm.
She got into a better law school than I did, see, so I have to defer. If you rear children, then you have had some uphill experience if you make any effort whatsoever. But if you want to hand over to your children any kind of character, any kind of sense of what does a person achieve in this world, then they've got to see you, moving against the stream on something at some point. Now, you and I both know from past experiences that we've had, we're mostly surrounded by people who are comfortable to be spectators and lurkers. And one of the things I do try to get to do, often people say, Ron, what's the one thing we can do to change things? As if I'm some wise guy. Well, I'm old, right? And that gives you a certain amount of.
Sure.
People, I think, need to do what you've done in your life. Step up and be counted and be prepared to be separated from the herd. Because if you're not, first of all, when you do, besides possibly maybe achieving, you encourage other people to achieve. You encourage other people to step up. We do, even those of us who, look, I mean, I'm with Army Dillon's law firm now. That's a group of troublemakers, a group of people who are willing to put their names out there. Again, you're a whistleblower. You know what I'm talking about. If you don't stand up for the truth at some point, you will have to compromise. It's like anyone who's ever worked in law enforcement. I mean, gosh, coming out of Brooklyn, the Serpico hearings were when I was very, very young, but everyone knew about that. The premise was, if you work in the New York Police Department, you're some kind of crook.
Mm-hmm.
And you're either in on it. It's kind of like the 1960s version of Training Day. You're either in on it.
Everybody gets a taste, or you make everybody else nervous.
Right. And if it's the latter, they're going to take care of you. They're going to take care of you. And that's how that, if anything means anything to you. Now, the amazing thing is in this world, there are a lot of conflicting, we've gone so far off where you wanted to talk about, but we've got so many conflicting feedback mechanisms. And one of them is money and wealth. And I remember reading a book or part of a book in college about, in America, we associate success with wealth.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, that's how you've made it when you've got.
That's how we keep score.
But in fact, I'd like to be wealthy. I'd like to have a short experience of it just so I can say I've been there and done that. But besides the fact that it makes you soft, being wealthy makes you soft, very few people are able to retain that sense of mission and remain wealthy or continue to earn money. And which is what makes what Elon Musk has done in the last couple of years so extraordinary. And there are really committed people who will stick their necks out, but a lot of moving parts to this.
No question about it. The original spot that I wanted to kind of hone in on, you said at some point you decided that you were going to be an observant Jew.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's disconnected from anything we were just talking about there. But at some point,
no,
you made
actually,
a concrete
it's
decision.
very much connected. Yeah.
Let's kind of hone in on what that. So were your family members, were they not observant, or were they not particularly?
They weren't. So like most people my age, I'm 60.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I had grandparents whose own grandparents and parents were religiously observant. This was true of most people most Jews in Eastern Europe 100 years ago. Then there was a massive dislocation that took place as a result of World War I, social dislocation as well as geographic and economic. A great deal of communities that for hundreds and hundreds of years had been insular and who did not expect to have any kinds of rights. The combination of the experiences of World War I and the changes in politics and regimes, as well as the influence of the Enlightenment from Western Europe, finally finding its way into Eastern Europe, and the scientific revolution, resulted in people of faith, a traditionally faithful community, losing its faith and going in the direction that Jews in Western Europe had already gone 100 years earlier. So by the time my grandparents were raising children, they were not observant. They spoke Yiddish at home, Judeo-German. That was their idea of how to ethnically realize. In other words, it was a very clear thing to people like my grandparents that, of course, we're Jewish. Of course, I'm a Jew. Not only that, of course, I'm a Jew, and I'm very proud of it because it makes me special somehow. That was just baked into them.
This is also food. This is style of speaking. These are vows. There's all of that.
But that was kind of cultural. I mean, again, my grandparents, they've by the time I'm born, they're living in Brooklyn by way of Havana. Like
what a wild
had plenty.
What a wild way.
Yeah, right. They've had plenty of opportunity to assimilate, but they did a very poor job of it because yes, they're Yiddish speakers. And my grandmother cooks what her mother cooked. So yes, you have this kind of cultural, but by the time, so here now, let's fast forward 20 years, I'm now in Princeton. Okay. And I'm a member of the Tower Club. And I'm going out with the daughter of the Unitarian minister, who is the nicest, finest person I ever met in my life. And yet, I know that we can never get married. But I'm also saying to myself, but unlike my grandparents, I'm not a bigot. Because I grew up in the 60s and the late 60s. And I'm not prejudiced against non-Jewish people. And I understand that our backgrounds are different, but what is it that makes me so certain that I have to raise a Jewish family and that to do so requires that I have a Jewish wife? And the thing about Princeton in particular, Princeton and schools like it in particular, is that as opposed to if I'd gone to Rutgers, my father tried to pay me off to go to Rutgers. He'd buy me a car if I go to Rutgers.
That's not
So
me.
they offered me a scholarship, and it was a lot less expensive than Princeton, which of course was chump change compared, even adjusted for 1980s money. I mean, the numbers were because the racket. It was a very different. The most you could borrow in those days was $2,500 from the government.
Yeah.
That was it. In any event, these elite schools provide tremendous opportunities for assimilation. Now, looking at me now as a 60-year-old man, much less with a yarmulke and a beard, you might say, well, Ron, you would never have passed anyway. Who do you think you're kidding? And that might be true. But what I did see was that other Jewish students who were further up the assimilation curve than I was, because their families had been in the U.S. for multiple generations, not just 1.5 as mine had been.
Mm-hmm.
I saw how assimilated they were, and indeed they didn't pass. They were still conspicuously Jewish to me.
Interesting.
Like Judar, I guess,
Yeah, you could see it. Well, it's like, I'm talking about my wife's buddies who are down in Texas who are not practicing, they're not observant Jews, and I would say that they are more obvious to us as New Yorkers than they are as Jews, which is also a thing, because the thing that is always, maybe this is why I have a fondness for talking to you. You remind me very much. I have two father-in-laws. I have my wife's stepfather and my wife's actual father. One of them is Italian from Manhattan, grew up in Manhattan, raised his family in Brooklyn, now lives in Florida. Classic New York story. The other one married with my mother-in-law at 16 years old, when she was 16, my wife was 16 rather. And then the stepfather, they now live in Connecticut, and he's non-observant and Jewish. The two of them have many similarities because they're both New Yorkers. And New Yorkers...
But the Italian guy is more Jewish style than your Connecticut Jew.
Maybe he's but he's like sort of an atheist and hates religion, and so I don't know. I don't know if that's true. Anyway, I see you as kind of like
religion. He's not an atheist. He's angry at God.
He hates that
really
people
hates religion,
care about
he should have no attitude toward it whatsoever. But
which I actually. Yeah, that may be the case. He does have a strong feeling about it. It's the same thing we talk about guns. Listen, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance if you live in New York and you have thoughts that don't make any sense. Like nobody should own a gun, but the police can't help you because you don't believe. He grew up with that police are all corrupt attitude too. And I was like, yeah, that's why we have the Second Amendment. And he's like, no, it just doesn't jive. But there is something New York about your character that is maybe more recognizable than specifically Jewish, minus the yarmulke. You take that off, and I don't know that everybody sees that. At least not across the country.
Right. No, I agree with you 100%. You go around the country and you meet guys like me, and you don't know anything about our religion, but yeah, this guy's. In fact, when I was registering, on the first day of law school, I was talking to a friend of mine who was also going to Northwestern, who was from the Upper West Side of Manhattan.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a woman behind us who had spent her entire life in the Chicago area, and she was Jewish. And she was listening to us talk, and she finally said, "You people from New York have opinions on absolutely everything."
That seems
yeah.
I
guess that kind of nailed it.
Yeah.
Anyway, So this raised my consciousness when I was at Princeton of what it means to be Jewish and what it means to assimilate, and that I really had priorities that I didn't really understand where they came from, other than just a sort of cultural gut feeling, which if that's all it is, I owe it to myself to transcend that, because why should I be deprived of love or other opportunities just because of a sort of a cultural bias? Meanwhile, however, my roommate for 3 of the 4 years that I was in school was a graduate of the high school division of Yeshiva University. And he was a Sabbath observer. And not only was he not a sort of medieval figure, because of course, growing up in New York, and my grandparents had a store on the Lower East Side, so I knew what Orthodox Jews looked like. But this guy was modern, and he majored in chemistry, and he graduated summa cum laude from Princeton. I mean, so here's a super smart guy. He's keeping the Sabbath, so obviously I see you can do that and succeed. He's at Princeton as I am, and all this consciousness raising resulted in my choosing to go to a summer program in Israel geared towards overripe fruits such as myself, or maybe I should say overripe fruit such as myself.
Love it.
Because that's one thing no one ever accused me of. And they knew it, that was what I was looking for. They explained to me, they filled in gaps. I mean, the fact is my late father, did not have much of a Jewish education, but he made sure that my brother and I had something of a Jewish education because he wanted us to make our choices regarding observance from a base of knowledge rather than a base of ignorance. And the vast majority of people who are critical of religion have no real understanding of what religions teach, much less the specific religion that they're usually criticizing, and seldom their own religion. And that often can include people who have attended. Some of the most anti-Catholic people in the world are people who will start out by saying, I went to Catholic school and
yes, or you'd be like my brothers. I have two brothers that are both sort of functional atheists at this point, or agnostics. I don't know what they claim, and they both went to Catholic university. One of them getting a degree in like theology, philosophy, and walked out. But that's like kind of a classic Jesuit move.
Okay, but that's a truly exceptional situation.
Well, if you knew my brothers, that wouldn't surprise you even a little bit. Like,
not surprising.
Built-in contrarians. I have a whole family of contrarians. If I told them one thing, they would set their watch the other way.
Well, I think there's a particularly American aspect to this, which is Americans, and we see this in social media all the time. Everyone's an expert on every damn thing, and Americans don't want to be told, and they're used to, and they take a great deal of pride in having this anti-authoritarian streak. And what people often call organized religion, and if you've ever been to an Orthodox synagogue, you would laugh at the concept of organized, but the concept or institutionalized religion makes people think, well, there are all these doctrines and there are all these ideas and then there are all these forms of conduct that I'm not going to have full comprehension of and that I'm going to be asked to do. And that's un-American because I'm a free man. And that isn't an unreasonable conclusion to come to if you have not been exposed to the idea that God is infinite. You will never understand in this world the true nature of what God demands of us and what the Godhead is about. And now it's only a matter of degree. And we have a tradition, this is actually something that came up in the recent weekly Torah reading, that when the Torah was given on Mount Sinai, the Jews said, we will obey and we will learn, in that order. In other words, look, you're God. You know what's best for us. You created us. You made a special mission for the Jews. Whatever it is, you gave us this recipe. Here's what you're going to eat. Here's what you're not going to eat. We're going to do it because you want what's best for us. And now we're going to spend the rest of our lives trying to figure out what you want, because we want to love you as much as you love us, which is impossible, but to at least get on that road for that level of affection and understanding. As somebody who prided himself on his intellectual attainments, this was something that I recognized I would have to do. And when I made the commitment to become observant, it was at a sort of what's called a beginner, what I call a beginner's yeshiva. Yeshiva university. People who may not understand this, yeshiva is a generic word that means a place where rabbinic studies take place. Yeshiva university is so named because it combines rabbinic studies with traditional collegiate study. So in this beginner's yeshiva, they certainly in the 80s, it's not the same now. If someone like me would make the commitment, say, okay, I want to live the rest of my life religiously observant. I want to do it. They'd say, okay, but I know you want to go back to law school now, Ron, but you don't really know what you're doing. I mean, your roommate in college grew up that way. You're not going to just recapitulate what you saw from. And I said, no, I'm an American. But also, not so much that. I was committed to it. And, I recognized that there are limits to autodidacticism, that I can only teach myself so much. But again, I came from this working class background, and I've been admitted to this top 10 law school. And I'm not going to just walk away from that to study in your yeshiva. Let me get the law degree, and I'll come back to yeshiva. And they said, Ron, no one comes back. You're not going to come back. So of course, I'll show you. 3 years later, right after the bar exam.
This is the Luke Skywalker story. You're just describing Luke Skywalker walking away and coming back. Did you know this? Did you know we were going to do a Yoda thing?
Well, I will tell you that my father and I have a much better relationship than Luke and his father.
That's probably good. If you cross swords with your father, it just doesn't end well.
My father did not really get me because he was a smart guy, but he was normal. He was not a nerd. But I came back. I've spent then 2 years in yeshivas before starting my legal career, and I was a different person, no question about it. Look, I was not such a wild and crazy guy in the first place. I had conservative tastes. I like girls, liked them a lot, but I tended to be a one-woman man all the time and wasn't much of a partier. I was kind of an intellectual. So
I like that you said nerdy. I can relate to that sort of thing. I like to be like a poet jock, or a jock poet kind of thing. I want to go.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and in fact, you mentioned being a jock. There was a period in my late teens when I said, I'm gonna force myself to be a sports guy. A sports guy.
How do you say it?
I had never sports. I mean, I'm not a natural athlete.
Mm-hmm.
Just trust it. Can't jump, can't run. But, I had some bulk and, upper body strength. I'm pretty good, actually, decent hitter. Cannot make a layup. But I kind of tried to make friends with and get into the sports scene, which were like with the nice Jewish guys who were, playing ball after school and that kind of thing. So for a couple of years, I was kind of a jock, but it didn't really take because it wasn't. And so when I got into high school and I found the drama clubs guy, I was home. that was your career. That was really where I wanted to be. And,
okay.
That was pretty much the end of sports.
You can't live in both of those worlds at the same time.
Oh, I think you can. But if you really suck at sports,
no, that's what I mean. Yeah, if you're not both good at both, you can't.
And you're a pretty good actor. It's kind of like with me on the SATs. I mean, yeah, I had a respectable math score, but I had a much more respectable English score, and so therefore I kind of left calculus behind in high school and went with the words instead of the integers.
What do you said that coming out after the yeshiva experience really changed the way that you went into law, and not from being conservative to not conservative to conservative, but to being maybe more principled. Is that would that be accurate? You had more.
No, I was always a goody two shoes. To tell you the truth,
that goes along with the nerdiness.
I was always pretty much a rule follower. I mean, I had my adolescent stupidities, but by and large, I was a pretty good two shoes. Um, but people who met me after yeshiva could tell the difference.
Mhm.
The way I spoke, the words I didn't use anymore that I used to use.
Uh-huh.
And I found that interesting because I didn't really think I was so different. I don't. What was fascinating to me was that a lot of things were, but here I was now in law school in Chicago. Well, this is like there were two steps. There was the commitment over the summer, and then sort of the self education during law school. And at Princeton, there had been this, which is in the New York area, there had been this community of modern Orthodox kids. So I said, okay, all major universities must have something like that. No, they don't. They don't. This is not New York. This is Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one guy in my class who was an observant, but he happened to be a Lubavitcher chassid. And Lubavitch that's Chabad. Those are the guys with the house in Crown Heights. And their thing is outreach. I mean, he wouldn't have been in law school otherwise because other Hasidim don't go to law school. So they kind of helped get me up the curve as well. And there were a lot of growth took place, as part of that experience. And that was kind of interesting because of my background, I was unusual among newcomers to the yeshiva world because I already understood Yiddish pretty well. Most people in my situation don't know a stitch of Yiddish. So, that kind of made it a little bit more interesting for me.
How critical is that, the Yiddish skills?
Well, that combined with the Brooklyny style enabled me, and plus having a good cup, a good head. Okay, I'm smart. I was able to pass for a non-newcomer, and I was also very sensitive to social cues.
Mm.
I knew how to dress, like how to pass. So it's not a matter of fooling people. It's a matter of not wanting to feel the social discomfort of being an outsider. So I was able to integrate well, but I was really an ignoramus. And even after 2 years of yeshiva, I had made what's considered to be very, very good progress, but it got me to the level where my kids were in 8th grade. Okay, and here I am, a 25-year-old Ivy leaguer. But it certainly helped. It got me a much better quality, girl who wanted a guy with that kind of background.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got into the professions, and I will tell you that, here I have broken through this ceiling that my father never could professionally. He was like a benefits clerk in one company, and then they kind of got smaller and smaller, and they had fewer and fewer benefits. He was like a really good guy and with a good head on, and he ended up becoming kind of a small-time private investor, and ended up having a decent retirement and providing for my mother decently well in a way that, I mean, people in our age can't even imagine that somebody with just a high school degree could do.
Right.
Unless they were in social media, of course.
Yeah, well, that's not real. That's so gross, and it's such a small fraction of people that can do that.
Then I get into this elite environment, and I'm leaving early on Friday, and I'm not really able to go out for lunch to network, and it's a gigantic choice. It doesn't just implicate that hour or that evening. It implicates the entire way that you relate to people, because you're just not developing the same kind of contacts and the same kind of social, shared social experiences. But never did I say to myself, boy, what a mistake. I mean, I had come to the conclusion that this was what and who I should be. And wherever things took me, I would do my best with them. Frankly, I had a harder time adjusting to the social milieu of the professions because of my socioeconomic background than I did because of my religious observance. Because I didn't really pick up on cues all around me that even that at Princeton, that people really studied assiduously in a way that I had never had to do in high school.
In other words, they spent more time just literally consuming
Studying,
books,
preparing for tests, doing outlines. And I didn't know how to do that because I had been in a much less competitive environment than kids from Chappaqua, okay? And I just was the best in the class, one of the 3 or 4 best in the class just by being Ron Coleman. And it wasn't until I got, and then when you're in college, you get to choose which classes you want. So you choose, the ones of less resistance. One thing I did do that was kind of intellectually idealistic was I majored in economics. When I didn't really, I'm not a quantitative person as such. And my interests were in history and politics. But I said, well, here's a paradigm for analyzing problems and behavior that will at least introduce some level of rigor into my thinking and I think that was very valuable for me. And it really paid off in law school because when I got to law school, Northwestern is good, but it's not full of people from Princeton, Harvard, and Yale. And I ran the table first year. By studying, because I had watched The Paper Chase, and I knew that in law school you do study. So
you learned that from the movie.
I wouldn't have known otherwise. Yeah.
That's so good. I think that's so relatable for most people too. It's like, how'd you know about that? I saw a movie. It just let me know what was coming. It's
That's how I learned manners. Standing up when a lady leaves the table in a restaurant, taking off your gloves when you shake someone's hand. My father's from the Lower East Side. He was a polite guy. Thank you, please. But these kind of niceties were not the kind of things that I was going to pick up at home. Nor did we have. I wasn't even interacting with people like that. I was interacting with a bunch of Eastern European, and Eastern Europeans are really blunt.
Mm-hmm. God bless them.
You put on a lot of weight.
Yeah, just straight up. No punches pulled, no niceties. So
it's a harsh world.
You mentioned that difference was not so much the religious difference that you saw, and even walking into the profession, but it was a class difference.
Yes, and it cost me. I remember, in fact, one time after I was at a Park Avenue law firm. I'm not avoiding mentioning it. It just doesn't mean anything to anyone.
That's fine. Yeah, nobody knows.
But one that was known as having a lot of Orthodox Jews. And one time, so we pray 3 times a day. Once in the morning before you go to work, once in the evening before you go to sleep, or after work, and then once in the afternoon or evening. And you've got to find a time to do it. And we had it's called a minyan, a group of 10 men who would meet in one of the offices at this law firm for this afternoon service. And one time, one of the older partners, who, an observant man, called me over and he said, I want to just have a word with you. And he said, you're going to have to change the way you interact with you're not going to make it in a place like this. You're too, maybe I think it's you picked up too much in the yeshiva world with the expressions and talking with your hands. And I really had no idea what he was talking about. I'd gotten through Princeton, I'd gotten through Northwestern, but he was 100% right. I was not clubbable. I really still had the stink of, history is full of people coming up from from much more modest backgrounds than mine and learning how to do this. And it might be that if I had been a really good law firm associate, I might have gotten away with being who I am. But I wasn't a very good law firm associate.
So
I didn't last.
They could tell where you were from. They could tell by your mannerisms, by your that sort of lack of polish. They used to have this thing. Do you ever heard of cotillion? You know what that is?
Yes. I've heard of it. That's the best.
I got invited. Yeah, I got invited one day to be some girl's date when I was in, I don't know, 4th grade or 5th grade. It was some, childish thing. And I went to it and they were doing the box step and they were doing the foxtrot. And I was like, what is this nonsense? Like, what is this all about? And they were talking about where the forks go. And I was like, who cares? Because that's not the world I came from. My dad grew up very, very modestly and then did really well. And but that wasn't our world. We were just like regular people. We didn't have multiple forks on the table. That's crazy. Well, what are you going to do? You have one fork. That's what you need. So I went to this thing, and there are people that do that, though. Like, they literally are raised in a way that is outside of my understanding and probably outside of what your understanding was at the time. And it's visible when you show up. And we can pretend at a certain age. You learn to observe around you and kind of adapt if you're a good enough chameleon. But if you don't even know what to look for, and you don't even know that there's a difference.
And Princeton was great for that. It was a finishing school for me in many respects, even though I didn't, even though Stanley could still tell that I was from Brooklyn. And but I did learn how to tie a bow tie, a real bow tie, and how to dress, the things you would learn. And then I go and spoil it by putting this really conspicuous big black yarmulke on my head. And I go to, I sometimes have occasion to go to formal events now, and I feel quite well prepared to present. And in fact, I would say that I'm on the upper quartile of nailing it in terms of, because I look around and I see how people, they don't know what they're doing with their evening clothes. Okay, and then I'm wearing the wrong kind of shoes. But I'm the one with the yellow star because I'm in a penguin suit, and then the black. This just does not. It just really doesn't go. That is what God wanted for me, and that's just And I will tell you what was a very interesting turning point, though. For most of my career, I did not wear my yarmulke in professional settings, especially as a litigator. Going into court, you don't want to cede anything, and you're there to represent your client and to maximize ethically and whatnot his or her or its results, not to make a statement about your faith or to tell people when you're not reachable or what you can and can't eat, whatever it is.
Yep.
When COVID came, and which is not to say that I was hiding, like everyone who met with me or worked with me knew, because when I would eat, and everyone saw me in a yarmulke, but it wasn't part of my presentation as such. But then when COVID came and we were all on Zoom, thinking, I'm taking off my yarmulke in my own house. No, I'm not going to do that. Now, to this day, I was in front of the Ninth Circuit a couple of weeks ago. Especially, guess what? There's a thing of anti-Semitism going around. You might have heard about this.
Yeah, we're going to get to that too, I think, because it's so wild how raw it is right now and on the surface.
And I, obviously, again, I'm not fooling anybody about who I am, but when you wear a yarmulke, people quite mistakenly are under the impression that if you wear a yarmulke, you're more of an Israel guy than someone else who doesn't necessarily. I just didn't want that baggage. And so, I went bareheaded in front of the Ninth Circuit. I don't know whether that's going to help my case at all, because I was brought in as a ringer on a kind of a stinker of a case at the very end. But this nonetheless became, around that time I started doing video on social media because the platforms became so much more powerful and amenable to it. And I began to socialize my wife. She's from New England. And she's a very modest and private person. And she knew that she was not marrying that kind of person, but she has this very, very well-developed sense of dignity and privacy.
Sure.
Which is, there's a lot of good reasons to marry someone who is your opposite. Not when it comes to values, but when it comes to personality. There are limits, and sometimes because I'm a bull in a china shop kind of guy, and she's a little pussycat. But
does she temper you?
Yeah, she does. As bad as it would be, as bad as it is, as many Ron Coleman faces you see staring out at you in my stream, it would be worse if it weren't for Jane. She has given me, at least the sensibility to understand that smearing yourself, as she puts it, around is not necessarily an inherent good.
Do you rub off on her in the same way that she has a little more assertive nature?
Yeah, a little bit. The fact is, she really, really hated Twitter
It's
for a
awful.
long, long time.
It's the worst.
But then she realized she's a writer.
Mhm.
If she wants anyone to read what she writes,
Yep.
she needs to be on Twitter. Unless you're really a very big established person, that's how it's going to be. So she sends me stuff to retweet, and you know, I mean, I wish she would get on the podcast with me because she's really smart. When she writes about something, she she said to me, Ron, what if we would have met when we were in college? Wouldn't that be cute? We would never have met if we were in college because you were in the library the whole time.
That's right.
I never went into the library. Plus, you would have looked at me and said, that kind of wild, irresponsible guy is not the kind of guy I'm looking for.
Yes.
So,
God has a plan. I don't always know what it is. I always tell people I can always see it in the rear view. That's when it sort of makes sense to me. That's me attempting to justify something that was always going to be and always made sense. But it made no sense to me at the time, and it makes no sense oftentimes afterwards. If it gets far enough away, you start seeing the bigger picture, and you go, "Oh, what an interesting arc that we are on right now." How
absolutely,
you can't see it; it looks like a straight line. The straight line looks like it's going in God knows what way, and then you look and you're like, "No, it was a natural curve. It always went to the way it was supposed to go." And my wife and I joke about this all the time too. We met when we were 27, and we would have never met before that. In fact, we actually did meet briefly. For one night, we were in the same dance club with some friends, and we were all kind of out. And she was the only gal that was there, and it was my buddies from college and buddies from high school, and there was nothing. There was nothing there. And then 2 years later, then it stuck forever. So that's kind of wild.
Well, so Jane and I were in law school at the same time. I was in Chicago, she was in Palo Alto, and I became a writer for the ABA's law student magazine, which was called Student Lawyer. Okay. And the editors there were fascinated by the fact that I was attending law school, but I was an observant Jew, and that I would walk up 8 or 10 flights to my dorm room on Friday nights because I couldn't take the elevator. And they just thought it was fascinating, and they asked me to write an article about this experience, which was much less common than it is now, although it was hardly exotic. But then again, I was from the New York area. So I wrote this article, and it actually ended up winning a couple of awards. And they had one of these little editors' words in the beginning of the magazine, and they had a picture of me and introducing the article and how much they liked it. And someone else who was in law school, a friend of my wife's, said, "Oh, why don't you marry this guy?" And she took one look at me in my leather bomber jacket, and said, "No, that's not what I'm looking for." Like, she wanted a rabbinical student looking guy, and I was a cool looking guy.
I love it.
She ended up actually getting the cool guy who dressed like a rabbinical student. So
that's the perfect jam. So my wife and I'll just share this kind of briefly. It's the same kind of sense. She says, everyone thinks that you're really mean, and I'm as mean as anybody. And I feel like that given the opportunity, oh yeah, if you're on the wrong side, I'm heartless. You talked about the guy that was born without a heart. I almost sociopathic. I have the ability to just, level in and get mission focused, but never with my wife.
Or with the FBI, after all.
You have to be able to do what we call flip the switch, which means that when it's time to do work, feelings don't matter. Nothing else gets in the way of accomplishing what is happening. And I'm very driven in that way. And I think it came from many, many years of being a swimmer, where I just had my own thoughts in the water and nothing else.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I love being alone. I in fact, even around people, I can be alone. As long as I can't hear you, I don't care.
No, I get that. Yeah, it's funny actually, because I'm an INTJ.
I should know what mine are, but I think that sounds right.
Yeah, I'm an introvert.
Me too.
But Ron, how can you be an introvert? No. At a party, I'm not afraid to talk to people, but I'm very happy to sit there with my own thoughts. I don't need it's a contradiction. But yes, you know what I'm talking
Your
about.
energy is not coming from being around those people. It drains you.
That's right.
It's exhausting to be around people for me, and I feel the same. We probably
especially when you're so much smarter than them.
That's the worst. There's nothing worse. I'll tell you a funny little story with one of my FBI bosses. She said something, the throwaway line, "I'm not the smartest guy in the world." Objectively true, right? You're not the smartest guy in the world. I'm not the smartest guy.
Even I don't think I'm the smartest guy.
Yeah, we've met people smarter than ourselves. And you'd be ridiculous. I knew a guy, I've said this once before, maybe on a podcast, but I had a guy in my class when I was in high school, and his physics notes were in the shape of a cartoon bird character. And he had an entire series that was called The Birds of War. And if you got drilled down, the tiny little lines were all physics equations that he was working through, but they were animation. Okay. Yeah. That's another level of weird smart. He also was socially kind of retarded. He just wasn't able to talk to people. He wasn't a cool guy.
Sure.
He was,
you might well expect.
As you might expect, almost, we would always say spectrum type, but he wasn't. He was just a very cerebral guy and his dad was a lawyer, and that was interesting. So long and short, he's that guy. So I know there are smartest people. I'm talking to my boss, and she says something to me, and I go, "Look, I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I know this. It was a setup to the next line. I know this is true." And she said, "Kyle, I think you're smart." It's like, who are you to affirm me? I don't require this of you. I don't know who you are, lady. And at some point, she pushed me, and then we started getting into breaking out where I stood in the IQ scores to let her know that I don't need her assurances anymore. She wasn't capable.
I was just saying it. I'm just saying it.
It's a throwaway line, lady. Get off my back. Like, exactly. You're not a good manager. We touched briefly on this anti-Semitism thing. I feel like we have Kamala Harris that's going to solve the problem in the Middle East now. That's really exciting for me. She's going to go and
she did so well at the border. I think you got to give her a shot.
And she's handled AI, so I'm no longer afraid of the Terminators. So all the things they put her on, she's handled. She's going to deal with the Middle East. What in the world is happening in this country where we have people that are blatantly saying the only solution is revolution and Intifada and all these other kind of wild things? People that don't even know what is going on in the Middle East or don't understand the conflict. They are now marching in the streets, shutting down traffic, mostly in the Northeast, it seems like, but all sort of live big city areas. How are you seeing that?
Well, these are mostly Muslims, overwhelmingly international students or recent immigrants from the Obama era. It's interesting to me that you're talking of, these are the ones who are snarling up traffic and, rushing into synagogues and, causing the real problems. And it's really important to understand that, yes, they are animated to, they really are. I think the word hate is overused. They're interested in asserting power and dominance. And they see Jews as part of the power equation in the United States, quite understandably, especially in universities, which are filled with these assimilated Jews who can't do enough to show how down with the revolution they are. And what they're mostly doing is flexing. I'm not saying that they aren't vicious anti-Semites, they are. But just the word hate has just become empty. It's become empty. They are confronting institutions, academic, government, you name it, and spitting it in their faces, not because they're interested in a saliva-covered face on the other side, but because they're pissing out territory. They are the vanguard of a Marxist, destructive nihilist movement. And I think all those words apply, all those adjectives apply, the mission of which is to undermine the institutions in the United States and in the West, to take what we have and which they cannot build for themselves, and they can never build for themselves in any country, anywhere. You take what we've built either for themselves or just to destroy it.
That seems more like it.
Just to destroy it out of pre-modern rage. And the institutional majority left, in other words, I mean white, overwhelmingly female now, even males are females,
Feminized.
either approve of this or have convinced themselves that they approve of it, which is by a much larger group than the first group. But they have hypnotized themselves into believing that they approve of it because they can't imagine any other way of living. And if they did, they couldn't say it. And that's the third category. They don't even believe that they approve of it, but they are terrified for their careers, for their standing, for their whatever, for their social standing. And it's it's hard for me to really envision. I mean, I've spoken to, I keep citing him. It's not name dropping, but he really helped me to understand a lot. James Lindsay, about the Marxist roots of this phenomenon. I'm hard pressed to believe that even in the darkest moments of the Soviet secret services during the Stalin era, that there was, and I have seen that video of that former KGB guy who says, "No, Ron, you're wrong. It really, this is what we plan and this is how we do it." I get that, but I think to some extent he would like to take credit for more.
This
There
is
is a
Yuri Bezmenov
natural-
or whatever.
I'm sorry?
Yuri Bezmenov or whatever his name
Right,
was.
yeah.
Yeah.
Right. There is a really strong inclination towards when a society succeeds. We see this in the history of every great civilization. It gets soft and it gets weak, and there's going to be some vulnerability somewhere. I don't know. To me, the generation that let this happen above all is the one that my generation grew up being told was the greatest generation. The ones who won World War II are the same ones who opened the gates to the barbarians in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when they were running things. And I remember even perceiving this as a young child in the late 60s when race riots and Vietnam protests were taking place, and wondering, when does somebody stop this? When do the people in charge, those white people with the square jaws and the full heads of hair who my dad doesn't look like? I remember we used to have the Dick and Jane, covers. And I always remember, I didn't know what it was, but I knew that dad didn't look like my dad. And I love my dad, but I could tell it was a different kind of.
This was the guy that he ate K rations, and he had a helmet that when he came home he didn't have that. He had the full head of hair and he wore like a tie or something. But before that, he was wearing
Absolutely
cigar.
So guys who are in charge, and why wouldn't they act like they were in charge? So there's this strain of liberalism, of American optimism. We let everybody have his say, and we have an airing of grievances, and we have better communication. It's going to be okay. And it seemed that we had gotten past that. And a lot of the problems that attitude permitted. But what we didn't realize was that, again, I don't really understand that it was people sitting around a real or virtual conference room table planning this out, because I think natural forces and people whose interests coalesce acted in a coordinated way that wasn't planned, but nonetheless, you've had this color revolution that is underway right now that just satisfied so many agendas. And when we left New York, one of the things, again, as a child in the early 70s, one of the things that was going on was busing. They were busing kids And I remember being so confused because my Eastern European relatives would say to me, "You have Schwarzes in your class." Why were they asking me that? Why did they care? Why did they even care? Like, who cares? And then
What does
we
that mean?
started getting
Help
kids.
me what that means.
Schwarze. You never heard the word Schwarze?
I may have, but it doesn't stay.
Yeah, so that's the Yiddish word for a black person.
That makes sense. I mean, that's what I took from context, but
Yes, so it's a famous scene from in Blazing Saddles. Mel Brooks playing the Indian chief, watching the black sheriff arriving. And he says, "Oh, Schwarzes, they darker than we are."
you could never make those movies today.
Couldn't do that today.
No.
The point is, though, when black kids from other neighborhoods started showing up in our schools, I was astonished. They were coming to school in underwear. In other words, T-shirts.
Right.
How do you go to school in your T-shirt? How is that a way to go to school? It was this big shock. And then we experienced 2016 and the rioting that took place, and no one who was in charge would do anything. It was such a deja vu. That
2016, we're talking post Freddie Gray, the sort
actually
of Ferguson, 2020.
No, 2016.
Yep.
No, but I mean after the inauguration
in 2017 when Trump was in.
He's right. He's right. 2017
okay.
After the 2016 election, it was that same feeling of why are we letting everything just utterly go to hell now? But in retrospect, as a conservative and someone who had, by virtue of becoming Orthodox, again, as my roommate had observed, I now really had a consistent worldview for being a bona fide social conservative. And I remember on the right, for one of the things that had really bothered me, I've been active in the Federalist Society, which everyone knows about, right? The lawyers, the conservative lawyers. Some of the leading lights of the Federalist Society, though, of the 90s, were very involved in achieving same-sex marriage. And, this was where the libertarians and the cultural conservatives really parted ways. And this is something that has really never quite been examined because it's uncomfortable for the conservative movement. But I knew that there was a certain amount of rot there. And besides, how pure can you really be? We're part of the entertainment complex, the news complex, the business complex, the government complex. These are all severely compromised. And I have a theme that I'm beginning to develop. I might have really actually found the book. We have been cursed with abundance. And it's not I'm not making some sort of vague connection between wealth or poverty and virtue, but rather saying a lot of the things that, when I said this sort of American optimism and this liberalism, which turned into affirmative action, which turned into DEI, which turned into explicit anti-white racism, there's enough to go around. There's so much freaking wealth out there, and so many people among the elites who have learned how to absolutely glom onto it in ways that you and I could only dream of. That there was the sense that, what's the harm? So we'll let people into schools who don't really belong there. They'll figure it out. Meanwhile, our system works. Everything works. And now it's 2024. And what do we see? Pilots who don't know what they're doing. Doctors who are being trained on wokeness instead of medicine.
Right.
Entertainment companies like Disney unable to enunciate a single rational creative work because of the damage all these, whether it's in brand equity, I mean, also the news and journalism business, and nothing's legit anymore. Nothing's legitimate. Everything is compromised because we thought we had enough fat, enough extra, that we could get away with moving away from meritocracy. Now, there's a legitimate argument that meritocracy is oversold. After all, I went to Princeton, and what it took me many years to learn was places like Princeton largely reinforce existing social networks. They're not there to introduce you and include you into new social networks. True, I made friends and contacts I never would have done. But those people were not inviting me to their events. I was not coming up to their houses for the weekend.
You weren't joining their country clubs that have been
I
there
wasn't.
for 200
That's
years
right.
or whatever, that kind of thing.
That's right. So yes, there is there's always been nepotism. There's always been, be that as it may, we know that hypocrisy is the tribute vice pays to virtue. By at least holding out meritocracy as a goal, we have a standard to say when favoritism or nepotism or departures from a meritocratic goal of achievement and capability and responsibility are not being met. And then we can have the discussion based on some baseline. What we've seen in the last couple of years is you may not even assert the existence of a baseline.
That's the problem, is the baseline for people now. And you know what's interesting is that, and I keep saying it in a different way, but I think we're saying the same thing. In the same way that people debase a currency, which has a standard, and you can depart from it, and you can cheapen the standard, which we've done, we also debased all of our institutions in that same way. And you're saying it as a departure from meritocracy. I'm saying people have basically, they've traded away their credibility. And to the point where they don't have...
was a great display of that. So the Supreme Court, I've been disappointed in the Supreme Court plenty over the last 10 years. The incrementalism, all the things. But one thing I did say was, I do believe there is a sense of seriousness retained in the Supreme Court, having stood in the well there, that has been lost in most of the courts where I practice on a more regular basis. So I don't know how long your delay is between recording and...
Yeah, we're going to play this in a couple of days, so this will still be fresh enough for folks.
So today, of course, is Monday the 4th, and the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that this taking Trump off the ballots because some either local trial judge or some state official like a Secretary of State has decided that he engaged in insurrection, and they're going to unilaterally declare that being the same as the Civil War. Okay. 9-0. How many commentators, distinguished professors, leaders in civil rights law and constitutional law signed their names to predictions that Trump would lose on this appeal?
Yeah, it's shocking. It's shocking because it's such a dumb, obvious statement. It's like there's no way the court retains any legitimacy and rules in favor of what they thought.
And to some extent, this is also an answer to, well, that incrementalism, Ron, that you are so critical of, and that overcaution gives that court the remainder of a backbone to do this, even when all the elites are saying, of course, they're not going to do this. Even to the extent that justices from whom we do not expect particularly rigorous work, one of whom has admitted that she doesn't know the difference between boys and girls, actually feel obligated to do their jobs.
It was too much of a shock to do this ridiculous. Like, this was a step too far even for them.
Look, it's an amazing thing that we live to see it, but look who they've left behind now. And now you have an entire sector of society that believes that there's one Supreme Court justice who happens to be the black male, who shouldn't even be allowed to decide cases because of some preposterous thing they cooked up, and which is largely coextensive with a group that believes that the entire Supreme Court is MAGA extremists, including Justice Jackson, Justice Sotomayor.
Yeah.
I mean,
having listened to their bump stock arguments and their questions, which they brought their fantasy world to play, and I don't listen to oral arguments at the Supreme Court all the time, but when I happen to be an expert on things like firearms and the way that they work, which I am, compared to any of them on the court for sure, compared to most people, I built them, I've taken them down to the springs. I can pick up a spring and tell you usually what weapon system it comes from. Not very many people do that.
Now, you had a very good shooting range story for me on my podcast.
It turns out, yeah, I know a little bit about that world. And when you watch a justice come in and say the purpose of the function of the trigger, which is the operative term, right, in the discussion of the Firearms Act of 1934, or the the NFA, she said it's to initiate a chemical reaction, and that's subjectively false. There are multiple things in the chain that is, sometime down the cause, the chain of events that happen, but not always. In fact, as I want to do on my podcast sometimes, I have one right here. We have a weapon system that is empty and there's nothing in it, and this is the function of the trigger, and you'll notice its job is to make the click, which is a hammer going forward. That's the function of the trigger. I can debunk what she said right there. They won't let you bring a gun into court, but that's the function of the trigger. That trigger functions properly. So she's wrong. But she brought that to bear anyway. And then for that lady to be a MAGA extremist is hilarious to me. It reminds me, 1-to-1, honestly. 51 intelligence officials. This has all the hallmarks of Russian disinformation. And then it didn't, because that was made up. This is the same sort of debasement, I think, for you to put your name to this opinion.
That's right. And the reason, again, someone just decided to stop in the middle of this, video and say, oh, they're talking about the usual MAGA complaints about, how the world's gone to hell. No, this is a very specific point and very relevant to what we've been talking about all along, which is, yes, a systematic debasement of meaning, of the very idea that there are boundaries, that there are governing standards that adults should be prepared to apply. I remember the big, I guess it was one of the banking meltdowns. And as an economics major, I learned all about moral hazard. And you just know every time there's going to be some kind of, whether it was the savings and loan crisis, whatever limit the FDIC said was the limit, Congress would say, no. Any amount you have, we got you covered. There are no consequences. Think of how our government operates now. No one is held responsible for anything, even when that person is personally responsible for something going terribly wrong. There's zero accountability. Mm-hmm. You don't win wars that way, Greatest Generation. But that's what they bequeathed to us.
Okay, this is where I wanted to end. You just said something that I hadn't thought of, because the Greatest Generation gets a pass on almost everybody's book. They always want to blame the boomers. And I kind of have listened to that, and it made a lot of sense. It's like, yeah, the boomers were the people that were busy doing their careers or cocaine or whatever was going on in the 80s, and they allowed things to happen the way that they did, and so the world went the way it went.
They were raised by their parents.
Yeah, it turns out, most likely, right? This idea that as these social revolutions were happening, the group of folks that went overseas and won World War II and liberated Europe in very young ages came over here and then ignored. They went back to work, they shut their mouths, they put their head down, and they tried to accomplish and build businesses and do the things that they did. But that generation essentially let a misbehaving teenager, let's call it, of the American youth, run the show. And we are now seeing it happen in the same way. So the question, I think, and I guess every generation is to blame every time one of these things happens, because my generation now in the 40s, we are now the folks that my generation went to war for a very different reason, but came back. A lot of folks that are listening to the show right now have either lost limbs, have lost loved ones, have given a lot for this country, even if those were for bad reasons, even if we look at it in the past and go, we don't think those were, just or ethical wars. They were fought, and the skills that picked up and the hardship that was endured were real, regardless. And when that happens, Is it time for my 40-something-year-old generation to start putting the consequences to these 20-somethings that are basically unruly teenagers that are acting out and seem like they're desperately in need of boundaries? Is that where the line has to be? Because it sounds like the greatest generation may have missed it.
Let's put it this way. Those children of the greatest generation are the octogenarians who are running everything still.
Mm-hmm.
The people your age are the ones who should be coming into their own. And instead, what they have done is signed up for a system in which, as long as they get a big piece of the pie, they don't care who's in charge. And remember, Joe Biden was chosen specifically to be the person regarding whom it doesn't matter who's in charge, because he would not, in fact, be in charge. Meaning that, as drilling down to what you said, the 40-somethings and 50-somethings who should be in charge now are being bought off. Look, I once almost tasted wealth.
Mm-hmm.
I once was in a law firm that was very, very profitable, a small law firm. And it began to occur to me that they were not, and I was an equity partner, they were not dealing faithfully with me. They were withholding information from me that was relevant to, that they had no right to withhold, that they were not playing fair with me. And I left that law firm and I never made that kind of money again. They couldn't believe it. Why would you run? We were paying you so much to do what you do here. Why would you complain about these insults to your self-respect? And many, many people would ask the same question. Answer, because you can't buy me. You can't buy me. And I didn't go through everything I've gone through in my life, which is white people's problems all the way down, okay? But what my parents and grandparents went through to enable me to live the life that I do today, and to have the healthy family that I have, and to make a living, even if I can't have the wealth, and to have a little bit of thought leadership role in a little tiny part of the intellectual, world, because I have things to say, and I'm willing to put my name on them, and to get involved in sexy cases from time to time, and share in a big win for all the many losses, because we do tilted windmills quite a bit in my little spot. I wouldn't have gotten to do any of those things, and I would have to give up all those things. And I had to leave 2 other law firms because of controversial social media cases or political cases that I took on. That's what life is about. Meaning. Goes back to the beginning of our conversation. It's about meaning. And to be bought off, I don't care if Joe Biden, I don't care if Joe Biden's not really in charge. I don't care if realize this, he's obviously senile. Mm-hmm. He's obviously senile. And the people around him, the 40 and 50-somethings around him, are just fine with it. And the people in the press room who are given scripted questions to ask, and who he calls on according to his cue cards,
yeah,
they're fine with it. They're making ridiculous money. They're all available to be bought. Every single person who looks at your career and says, Kyle Seraphin, there's a guy who wouldn't be bought. He's not going to make more money. Don't you love when people call you a grifter because you want to do a podcast and maybe you want to get a sponsor, or maybe you want to monetize, on a platform? Grifter. You don't have the slightest inkling of what I've given up for principle. And now you want to deny me the ability to bring in $5 a monthly subscription, and you're going to call me a grifter?
That's it.
Anonymously? Keep doing what you're doing, Kyle.
It's That's really fun stuff too. There's something very amusing about people calling out with, like you say, calling you out on social media with this sort of nonsense. It's like, number one, I've already shown you that I did the math on it. You'll appreciate this. You do the math on what your career is worth. If you have a constant income with a steady growth and the curve is predictable, and then you have a pension and that's predictable as well, and adjusted for inflation, et cetera, you can do it out. It's about $5 million worth of benefits and paychecks that I walked away from. And that's not that much money. I mean, it's a lot of money to me. It's a lot of money to a lot of people, but that's not like the kind of money that you could buy my soul for. Because I don't know what my cost is, but it's a lot higher than that. And so you think I'm going to sell it out for $5 a person on a subscription, or for $500 for a tweet, which somebody accused me once of, that we were taking money for tweets? It's like, have you lost your ever-loving mind? I went for an entire year without a paycheck. Like, I went for a whole year where I just didn't quit until the FBI showed up with a letter that said, we're investigating you for 13 different charges, including a felony. And I went like, well, that's not real. And I'm not going to be an internal affairs investigation for you and make it any easier. So my attorney and I had this like easy conversation where it's like, all right, dude, he goes, there's nothing that you're going to benefit from doing this. And by the way, they accused me of things like having my podcast and putting an upside down picture of the badge like you see spinning there as a federal, that was a misdemeanor according to them, which is absurd. These are publicly available designs. I mean, we pay for them with our tax dollars. Anyway, actually, that'd be an interesting sort of trademark discussion at some other time, the federal badge being used. But what a weird moment. And it all comes down to a lack of values. And I have to believe, if you believe that there's a God and there's accountability at the end, and that you're going to be meant to explain. I always say we're accountable for every round that we send downrange. That means verbally. That means, a weapon system doesn't make a difference. Whatever you're shooting downrange, you're accountable. That's yours. Own it. And if you're
there's a judge and there's judgment.
There's a judge and there's judgment. That's exactly it. And at the end of the day, if you think that you're going to be accountable for all those things, and it's cool for you to ask soft questions and be a Gavin Newsom who pretends like Joe Biden is so tough that you couldn't even keep up with him on his schedule, or whatever other phony thing they've said. Saturday Night Live made fun of this, by the way. Did you see that?
No.
I will send you a link. They
do.
They had this pretty white lady, whoever she is, the guest host, who just lampooned all of these leftists. They're like, now we're going to go to someone from the Golden State Warriors who said, he's like, oh, Joe Biden dunked on me. It was disrespectful. He did a windmill. Like they have to debase themselves to act like something that we know is not true. Same way they talked about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, by the way, that she was working out so hard that 25-year-old journalists couldn't keep up with her. It's like, I want to put a bullet in my brain when I hear that stuff. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. It's embarrassing.
And they're not embarrassed, and they
Nope.
know that we know that they're lying. And when everything is negotiable,
Yeah, there's no concrete standard. And that's the opposite of Western society. And all of Western civilization has been based on a standard.
what it's supposed to be anyway. There's always been that tension, but you're supposed to aspire to do better.
Couldn't have said it any better. That's it. Can't be bought. I appreciate you jumping on with me. Let me throw this up on here. What's the best way? What do you like people to come? Do you like to mix it up on Twitter best?
Find it on Twitter. Then you're going to get everything else shoved in your face if you get to Twitter. Yeah, and plus I've got the spelling there. I've got I've been on Twitter taking up real estate for quite some time. I had a lot of fun.
I appreciate your hot takes. I appreciate that you're a reverend and can't be bought. Thanks for joining me today. That was fun. That got more serious than I thought. I thought we were going to have more silliness, but the world is too serious sometimes, especially on this.
If they really want fun, they can go to the Coleman Nation episode. We did laugh a lot. We laughed, we cried.
I went back and watched that whole episode again, just so you know. I watched it again by myself and laughed at myself, telling jokes that I had already told. That's how much fun I had with it.
That is fun. That's a high level of fun, ladies and gentlemen.
It is.
Subscribe.
That's it.
Griff.
Ron, thanks for joining me, buddy. I hope we do this
Catch you
again.
later.
Thanks, bud.